Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where muddy gardens meet military conquest, and where one of history's most feared generals may, or may not, have had a soft, squishy spot for snails. You're standing in the warm haze of a Corsican morning. The air smells of wild herbs and damp earth. Somewhere, not far from your muddy boots, a snail with a gently spiraled shell is inching across a stone, utterly unaware it might be a favorite of young Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, that Napoleon. And while you're trying to picture him, possibly cradling a snail like a tiny wartime pet, don't get too comfortable yet. You probably won't survive this if you're allergic to absurdly slow plot development. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the village of Ajaccio, Corsica, 1769. Napoleon has just been born into a modest family with noble aspirations and a whole lot of kids. The Bonapartes are not poor, exactly, but let's say they're one major shoe repair away from it. You spend your days in woolen stockings, dusty courtyards, and olive groves full of secrets. Even as a toddler, Napoleon seems intense. Other children chase goats and throw sticks. Napoleon stares at the horizon like he's calculating artillery angles. He rarely smiles, unless someone brings him books or bugs. But one of his earliest fascinations? Snails. Not as lunch. Not as targets. But as tiny travelers. He'd crouch beside stones and flower beds, shirt rumpled, hair stuck to his brow, watching them for hours. His siblings would tease him for it. Snails again, Napoleon, they'd cry, using his Corsican nickname. He'd just shrug and mumble something about their resilience. You'd think he was planning to recruit them. Corsican culture at the time wasn't particularly snail-friendly. People saw them as food or pests, not companions. But little Napoleon? He saw something else. Maybe it was the slow and steady pace that appealed to a boy forced to live with a dozen noisy relatives. Or maybe, just maybe, he liked that they carried their homes with them. He too was a wanderer at heart, even at 6. There's a mostly forgotten letter, possibly apocryphal, that young Napoleon wrote to his great-uncle, thanking him for a toy drum. In the margins, there's a strange drawing, a snail wearing a bicorn hat. Historians still argue whether this was doodled by Napoleon or added later by an amused archivist with too much ink and not enough deadlines. But even serious scholars agree, the natural world, and particularly small, overlooked creatures, had a calming effect on him. Before the noise of war, before the cannon blasts and ego battles, there was a quiet boy in a garden who didn't mind getting his knees dirty. One elderly neighbor, Madame Rain, later claimed that Napoleon once spent an entire afternoon rescuing snails from a puddle after a storm. He placed them, one by one, upon dry stones, she said. It was as if they were his soldiers, retreating from the flood. Naturally, no one wrote that in his official military biography. You can imagine him. Tiny boots, tattered cuffs, a scowl that would someday send armies fleeing, gently lifting a slimy gastropod onto a fig leaf. All while plotting imaginary invasions of distant lands. Corsica itself shaped much of this early sensibility. The island's rugged cliffs and whispering forests offered plenty of time for reflection. The French had annexed the island just a few months before his birth, and there was always tension in the air. You couldn't throw a stone without hitting a rebel or a goat. Maybe this unrest made the slow calm of Snails even more appealing. Now, don't get me wrong. Young Napoleon wasn't all softness and shells. He once threw a tantrum so intense it shattered a family teapot. And when his brother Joseph tried to squish one of his precious snails as an experiment, Napoleon chased him through the garden with a rake. But it wasn't just affection, it was admiration. He saw strategy in their spiral, fortitude in their slime. Even later, as he studied ancient history and military campaigns, he'd often highlight the importance of terrain, of endurance, of patience, just like his childhood friends in shells. You tiptoe back from the past, just slightly. Now the boy has grown a bit. He's preparing to leave Corsica for the French mainland, off to attend military school at Brienne. He's anxious, aware of his accent, his status, his family's expectations. But tucked into his satchel, there's something wrapped in soft cloth. Not a sword. Not a family heirloom. Just a small box. Inside, a tiny painted rock, once used as a snail perch. He carries it with him like a secret proof that, even in the world of cannons and cavalry, a piece of the garden still clings to him. You stand at the edge of a windswept courtyard in northern France. Brienne-le-Château isn't exactly welcoming. The skies are gray. The bread is gray. The uniforms are itchy. And if you're a short Corsican boy with a thick accent and zero friends, let's just say the weather isn't the only thing cold. Napoleon Bonaparte has arrived at military school, and life here is not a warm bowl of lentils. But he adapts, slowly. Brienne's rigid schedule, long days, and strict discipline would make most kids wilt. Not Napoleon. He absorbs every lesson like a sponge: math, science, tactics. He excels at artillery and geometry, though he sulks through fencing. His instructors note that he seems old. Not aged, just older than he ought to be. Like a boy who has already fought 10 invisible wars in his head before breakfast. And yet, between all the stoic studying and stiff marching, something strange persists. You spot him crouched again, behind the academy's greenhouse, under a sagging hedge, watching snails. Not eating them. Not dissecting them. Just watching. He's taken to leaving crumbs of rye bread near a patch of moss where a few local specimens make their slow appearances. If you ask him why, he might mumble something about observation, or natural order, or the elegance of spiral engineering. But one classmate recalls him whispering to one. "Be patient," Napoleon allegedly told the snail. "Speed is for the careless." By now, students are beginning to notice. They call him the little hermit, half in jest. A few even try to prank him by placing snails in his boots, but he doesn't react. In fact, he returns the boots, cleaner, polished, even. It's unnerving. One of the school's gardeners, an older man named Claude, takes a liking to Napoleon. They bond over compost, cold lunches, and yes, mollusks. Claude teaches him how to build a basic terrarium using a shoebox, 2 glass panes, and some damp earth. It's the kind of friendship built in quiet spaces, with no need for words louder than a whisper. Historians still argue whether this phase was a coping mechanism or a genuine fascination. Was it loneliness that drew Napoleon to Snails, or a deeper philosophical attachment? Some biographers dismiss it as romantic nonsense, others suggest it shaped his core belief in endurance over impulse. You follow him through the seasons, slipping through snowbanks, sneaking to his garden patch at dawn, tucking a spare crust of bread inside the pocket of his greatcoat. There's even a rumor he wrote an essay for Latin class comparing Julius Caesar to a garden snail. The essay, unfortunately, is lost to time or perhaps conveniently hidden. On weekends, while others are fencing or practicing cavalry drills, he tends to his small snail habitat. It's crude, but functional. He observes their trails, measures their progress with chalk lines. He names two of them, Optimus and Brutus. Don't read too much into that. Once, during a thunderstorm, a loud crack sends students scrambling indoors. Napoleon? He runs out, cloak flapping behind him, to rescue his terrarium from the downpour. He returns drenched but victorious, two snails balanced in his palms like sacred relics. They fear nothing, he mutters, teeth chattering. You lie there now, listening to the patter of rain on a tin roof and imagining this fierce little boy protecting slugs like sacred kings. The image is absurd, but oddly tender. His professors note his peculiar mix of brooding solitude and eruptive leadership. He gives no quarter in debate, and once corrected an instructor's troop maneuver diagram with brutal clarity. But he's never cruel to animals. Even the ants get spared. They have order, he says, and purpose. By 15, Napoleon has become a paradox. The aggressive tactician and the gentle observer. The future general who handwrites snail population tallies in a weather-stained notebook. You wonder if anyone else noticed this quiet rebellion against expectations. In a place built to produce soldiers, he is already something else. Not just a strategist, but an odd, slow-burning philosopher in boots 2 sizes too big. Claude, the gardener, leaves the academy a year before Napoleon graduates. Before departing, he gifts the boy a small carving, a snail in polished oak. Napoleon doesn't say much, just nods. Years later, that same carving will be found among his personal effects at the Tuileries Palace, nestled between maps and medals. Still, snails aren't mentioned in his military evaluations. No one writes, top marks in artillery, possibly obsessed with gastropods. That detail, like so much in history, simply trails off into silence. But if you squint at the edges of the reports, you might catch glimpses. One examiner notes his quiet persistence, another remarks on his patience beyond his years. A third complains he takes too long with decisions, as if calculating in spirals. There it is again, the spiral. The slow circle. The logic of snails. You're walking now through the long stone corridors of Brienne for one final time. His boots echo against the flagstone. His papers are packed. His uniform pressed. But in the side pocket of his coat, a folded note. And inside it, a single snail shell, carefully cleaned, the spiral intact. He's off to Paris next. The Royal Military Academy awaits, with higher stakes and harder lessons. But as he boards the coach and stares out the window, there's a faint, satisfied smile on his face. Maybe he's thinking of Corsica. Maybe he's imagining Optimus and Brutus, sliming their way toward glory. Or maybe he just prefers things that move at their own deliberate pace. You're hunched over a splintered desk in a candlelit dormitory in Paris. The year is 1784, and the Royal Military Academy of École Militaire smells like sweat, old leather, and too many teenage ambitions. You tug your boots tighter, listening to the scratch of quills and the occasional snore from exhausted cadets. Among them, one head is always down, scribbling with furious purpose, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now 17, Napoleon is still short, still intense, and still, somehow, the oddest person in every room. He finishes assignments early just to rewrite them better. He argues with instructors. He reads more than anyone else, especially books on the Romans. His favorite? Plutarch's Lives. Because nothing says bedtime like moral lessons from dead generals and assassins. But hidden between his worn copies of Caesar and Livy is something softer. You spotted one evening. A folded piece of paper, stained with something that might be ink or possibly snail goo. It's a short essay, not for class, not for anyone. Just a page titled The Virtues of the Spiral. The handwriting is tight and disciplined, the tone almost poetic. What appears slow, he writes, is not idle. It is deliberate, fortified in form. The snail has no sword, yet it endures. You blink. Is Napoleon romanticizing mollusks again? Yes. Yes, he is. And if that's not enough, there's an even stranger piece, a short Latin verse. Roughly translated, it reads, "O coiled traveler, you mock the storm, and bring your house to war." You can almost hear him whispering it to himself, like a secret mantra before drills. His fellow cadets think he's odd, no surprise there. While they sneak off to taverns, Napoleon stays behind, organizing his notes with the precision of a general and feeding a tiny snail named Cato in a walnut shell lined with moss. He keeps it near the window, right beside a stack of rolled maps. He prefers damp weather, Napoleon once mutters to no one in particular. It's during this time that he begins to frame his view of the world in systems of force, resistance, and terrain. He writes a long treatise, never published, on how natural observation builds strategic wisdom. One draft includes a sketch of a siege formation inspired by, wait for it, the coiled path of a snail. Historians still argue whether this was satire, sincere philosophy, or a moment of youthful madness. But the spiral remains. Again and again. In diagrams, metaphors, even the way he folds his correspondence. Some say it's coincidence. Others believe it's the core of his thinking, fortified, patient, adaptable. A mind that knew how to retreat in order to outflank. You follow him to the library, past rows of dusty shelves and stacks of parchment. He's not reading military history tonight. He's thumbing through a book on mollusks, borrowed under a pseudonym. He's memorizing their anatomical structure, fascinated by their simplicity and self-sufficiency. He once tells a tutor, the snail carries its home through every battlefield. If only we all had such clarity of purpose. Okay, it's a little dramatic, but it's also kind of beautiful. You're sitting with him during a rare moment of stillness, a light rain tapping against the dormitory glass. Cato the snail is inching slowly across a square of parchment, leaving behind a delicate shimmer. Napoleon watches with a softness few ever see. He does not hurry, he says. He endures. Then, one evening, he's called into the headmaster's study. His father has died suddenly. The news hits like a musket ball. Napoleon says little, but you notice something: the walnut shell home for Cato disappears from the windowsill. No word. No explanation. He begins to throw himself even deeper into studies, ambition now hardened by grief. His writings grow sharper, more calculating, less sentimental. But when one student mocks the natural sciences, specifically mollusks, Napoleon reportedly growls, "Mock them at your peril." The soft often outlast the strong. You get the sense he's not just talking about snails anymore. His graduation is swift. He finishes his training in just 1 year, instead of the usual 2. He's broke, brilliant, and barely able to afford proper boots. But he's ready. Ready to enter the real world, and perhaps leave behind the softer parts of himself. Except, not quite. One of his few surviving personal notes from this period ends with a single line, unrelated to the rest of the document: "Even the smallest creature defies death when cloaked in purpose." You close your eyes and drift for a moment, imagining him crossing the parade ground, boots echoing on cobblestones, his gaze already beyond the horizon. But somewhere, tucked in the folds of his overcoat, maybe between orders and maps, there's still a spiral. A small reminder of quiet strength. Because for all his fire and thunder, Napoleon was still, in part, that strange Corsican boy watching the garden floor. And whether the world remembers it or not, that softness shaped him just as much as any sword. You're standing on the edge of a smoky harbor now, the salt sting of the sea curling around your nose. It's 1793, and the city of Toulon is in chaos. The British have occupied the port. The French Republic is in shambles. And somewhere in the middle of this firestorm, a 24-year-old artillery officer is sketching angles in the dirt with a stick, his boots soaked, his eyes fierce, and his stomach probably rumbling. Napoleon Bonaparte is about to become famous. The siege of Toulon will be his breakthrough, a chaotic ballet of cannons, trenchwork, and opportunism. He seizes the moment, makes bold moves, positions artillery on high ground no one thought to consider. He pushes past hesitation, and for the first time, people notice. They start whispering the name Bonaparte with something like awe. And a little fear. But in the midst of the boom and bluster, there's a quieter moment most historians leave out. After a key victory at Fort Mulgrave, legend has it Napoleon asked for something unexpected. Not wine. Not applause. Not roasted meat. Snail soup. No, really. It wasn't the fancy garlic and butter escargot you're thinking of. This was a humble, provincial broth, a Corsican comfort dish, cooked slow over coals with herbs, leeks, and the tiniest of land snails, gently simmered until tender. Accounts differ. Some say he asked for it out of nostalgia, a taste of home after weeks of military rations. Others claim he didn't eat it at all, that he merely asked for it, watched the pot simmer, then walked away. Historians still argue whether the soup was for nourishment or memory, as one scholar writes, but either way, it lingered. What's known is that Napoleon had a strange reputation in the officer ranks. Not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his quirks. He rarely ate much during campaigns. He took long, silent walks. He wrote letters to his brothers full of strange metaphors. And according to one aide, he once paused mid-battle discussion to move a garden snail out of harm's way. Was this the behavior of a man losing his grip? Or a man gripping something deeper than most dared to hold on to? Either way, the snail imagery returns. He refers to an enemy line as coiled and ready to snap. He describes a retreat as sliding backward, leaving no trace but shine. And when he diagrams battlefield formations, you can spot a faint spiral in the margins of his maps. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's just habit. You find him one night, post-battle, sitting alone by a campfire. The men are drinking, the drums are silent. He holds a tin cup of lukewarm broth. There's a snail shell floating in it, barely visible. He stares at it for a long time. Then, quietly. Even in war, there must be pause. It's this uncanny ability to hold chaos and calm in the same breath that makes him both magnetic and unnerving. He's not like the other officers. He's too young, too driven, too strange. But undeniably effective. After Toulon, he's promoted. Word spreads. He's the Corsican genius, the boy artilleryman, the one with the wild eyes. But none of them mention the snails. Except for one. A letter survives from a fellow officer named Marmont, written to his cousin. It reads, "Bonaparte is either mad or magical. I caught him yesterday feeding breadcrumbs to a snail beside a cannon. He called it Augustus." Yes. Augustus. Again. You can almost hear Napoleon's voice, low and amused. Snails do not charge. They conquer slowly. Soon after, he's sent on campaign again, Italy this time. Bigger scope, bigger stakes. But in his travel trunk, amidst the maps and military codes, is a small jar. Inside, soil, moss, and what looks suspiciously like a shell. It's hard to know what survives history and what melts into myth. But the detail clings like slime on a boot heel. Was it ritual? Sentiment? Superstition? Maybe he saw the snail not just as a symbol of home, but as a lesson. In strategy. In persistence. In surviving storms without losing shape. Remember. This is a man who would later say, victory belongs to the most persevering. And perhaps that perseverance was born not only in books and battlefields, but in gardens, rain puddles, and moments when he could have stepped forward, but chose to kneel instead. You drift now through the haze of cannon smoke, into the calm before the next clash. Napoleon's star is rising, his boots are muddied, and somewhere, maybe near a rock, maybe on a leaf, a snail is inching forward, unnoticed. And that, somehow, feels exactly right. You're trudging up a dirt path in northern Italy now, boots crusted with old mud and new ambition. It's 1796, and Napoleon Bonaparte has just been handed command of the Army of Italy, a scrappy, underfed bunch of soldiers held together by grit, threadbare uniforms, and a general lack of socks. He's 26. Still short. Still intense. And very much still Napoleon. This campaign will be one of his finest hours. His swift, brilliant victories at Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli will reshape the map of Europe. His style is bold, unorthodox. He moves fast, strikes harder, and thinks 10 steps ahead while the enemy is still buttoning their coats. The French press calls him a military meteor. But despite the grandeur, you find a quieter thread beneath the victories. Napoleon still hates eating snails. Yes, you heard right. Despite being raised in a snail cuisine culture and surrounded by officers who enthusiastically slurp them at post-battle banquets, Napoleon remains uninterested. Not squeamish. Just philosophically opposed. According to one dinner guest, when offered a delicately roasted plate of escargot and butter and garlic, he replied, "They look too much like friends." Pause. Let that sink in. Too much like friends. This is not the voice of a ruthless conqueror. This is the voice of a man who once held a mollusk funeral. And yes, that's coming up. But for now, you're at a dinner table in Milan. It's a victory feast. The wine is flowing, the officers are laughing, and the plates are stacked with delicacies. Someone leans over, nudges a platter toward Napoleon. "General, try one, this batch is from Burgundy. The best." He peers down. The shells gleam. The garlic wafts upward. He lifts his fork and sets it down. "No," he says. They march with dignity. Everyone laughs. But later, in private, his valet finds the general staring out a window, muttering about patience, terrain, and how the strongest armies are the ones that move at their own pace. Historians still argue whether this anti-escargot stance was symbolic or sincere. Some claim it was part of his personal mythos, a deliberate quirk to humanize him. Others think it was a holdover from childhood memories. But a few, the more eccentric biographers, suggest he simply couldn't bear the idea of eating something he had once named. Because yes, there were names. You stumble upon a half-destroyed campaign journal from this era, its margins dotted with idle doodles, cannon placements, troop movements, and tiny snail shells. Some are labeled Tiberius, Lucilla, Antony. Roman names for gastropod companions. Or perhaps metaphors. Or possibly both. One entry, wedged between battlefield coordinates, reads, "Today we took Verona." Cato would have appreciated the stones. There's no elaboration. No context. Just that. You start to notice it everywhere. A turn of phrase here, a curious metaphor there. During the Battle of Arcole, when asked why he delayed a direct charge, Napoleon reportedly said, "Even the snail knows when to wait." Who says things like that? Napoleon, apparently. His troops, by now, are both awed and slightly baffled by him. He's fast on the battlefield but slow in conversation. He can charge into musket fire without blinking, but will pause an entire march to observe dew on a leaf. He sleeps little, eats less, and writes obsessively. His letters to Josephine are infamous, Yes, but so are the ones where he compares her patience to that of a snail beset by hail. Not the most romantic metaphor, but hey, it's the thought that counts. And then, of course, there's the incident. A senior officer, possibly Yawns or Berthier, once brought roasted snails as a gift during a particularly muddy campaign. It was meant to be a treat, something rich and warm in a cold tent. Napoleon took one look, frowned deeply, and, according to legend, held a small, impromptu funeral. He wrapped the snails in cloth, placed them gently in a small tin box, and dug a shallow hole near the roots of an olive tree. With only a candle stub and a broken spoon as a shovel, he murmured a few Latin phrases and covered the box with earth. When asked why, he allegedly replied, "They deserved better than butter." You cannot make this up. Or maybe you can. Historians still argue whether this event actually happened or whether it's a piece of bizarre Napoleonic folklore passed down from drunk officers at too many reunions. But it sticks. Like snail slime on silk shoes. You begin to realize something strange. The more powerful Napoleon becomes, the more he clings to this odd habit of mollusk reverence. It's not a superstition. It's not sentimentality. It's a quiet resistance to the brutality that surrounds him. Because in a world where men are measured by how fast they charge and how loudly they shout, he holds on to something slow. Something soft. Something that doesn't conquer with fire, but with time. So here he is. The general of the army of Italy, a man with empires in his sights and snails in his heart. Marching not with hunger, but with memory. You fall asleep to the faint echo of drums, hooves, and the gentle scrape of a shell against stone. You're standing on a sun-baked slope, sand gusting into your sleeves, and the air so dry it crackles in your nose. It's 1798. And you've just landed in Egypt with General Bonaparte. This is no ordinary conquest. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign is part military expedition, part scholarly field trip, part fever dream. It will give the world the Rosetta Stone, weeks of heatstroke, and more camels than any Frenchman had previously seen in one place. But today, amid pyramids and plagues and cavalry and turbans, there's a tiny, whisper-soft detail you'd never expect. Someone, an aide-de-camp with a terrible sunburn and excellent penmanship, has smuggled a small glass jar through customs. Inside, 3 French garden snails, alive, dazed, and tucked in with bits of lettuce and damp cloth. And the label? Pour le General. Yes. For Napoleon. Because apparently, even in the middle of a colonial misadventure on a different continent, someone remembered, the general likes snails, not for dinner, but for companionship. Let's rewind. When preparing for Egypt, Napoleon invited dozens of scientists, engineers, artists, and naturalists along for the ride. He wanted to map the Nile, record its fish, study its bugs. It was a bizarre blend of conquest and curiosity, bring cannons, but also bring microscopes. Somewhere in that swirl of planning, a story goes, Napoleon made a quiet request to one of his officers, "Bring me something that remembers the garden." Interpret that how you will. The officer, possibly confused, showed up in Alexandria with 3 living snails. Historians still argue whether this was done as a joke, a gesture of loyalty, or as a genuine response to a deeply poetic moment. But what's clear is this: for at least part of the Egyptian campaign, Napoleon had a small traveling terrarium, an improvised snail enclosure, reportedly a repurposed tea box, lined with wet cloth and carried discreetly among his field effects. Picture it. Cannonballs rolling, camels braying, the pyramids looming in the distance. And tucked behind a tent flap, 3 snails inching their way across lettuce, probably wondering how they ended up 2,000 miles from Dijon. Bonaparte would visit them at night, in quiet moments between planning sieges and dodging sandstorms. He even named one, Horus, after the falcon-headed Egyptian god. The irony, he apparently noted, was entirely intentional. And while most of his officers dismissed this as another of the general's strange habits, along with his refusal to carry a blanket, his obsession with geometry, and his tendency to write letters at 3 a.m., some were quietly charmed. One of his scientific team, a botanist named Delacroix, recorded in a field diary, "The general examined a snail today. He said, 'See? It carries home, even here.' Then he went back to drawing artillery plans." You pause for a moment, watching the sun drop below the desert hills. It's beautiful here, if you ignore the dysentery and relentless insects. And perhaps, like those snails, Napoleon is trying to make a kind of home in the unfamiliar. It wasn't all charming, though. The Egypt campaign was rough. Harsh terrain, heat exhaustion, fierce resistance from the Mamluks, and the looming specter of British ships just offshore. Morale dipped. Water ran low. Men grew sick. And yet, there was a softness in the chaos. One soldier recalled a night when Napoleon's tent was left open by mistake. Inside, by lamplight, the general sat at his map table. He wasn't reading orders. He was tracing the shell of a snail with the tip of his pen. Slowly. Thoughtfully. He looked like a priest, the soldier said. A priest of some very slow religion. Perhaps that's what made Napoleon so dangerous. He was never just a soldier. He was a philosopher in uniform. A romantic trapped in a gunpowder world. And the snail, absurd as it sounds, was a symbol of that inner contradiction. He wrote fewer notes about them now, but the metaphors still surfaced. He described certain maneuvers as coiling to strike, and praised the enemy's defenses at Acre as solid as a shell. In one particularly dusty dispatch, he closes with the phrase, "We advance slowly, but our house comes with us." Again, that idea of self-contained strength. Of home amid movement. Of slow power. It's not always clear whether he believed these metaphors himself or simply liked the rhythm of them. But in a world that measured value by explosions and empires, his quiet devotion to creatures that left shimmering trails in the sand is oddly moving. By the end of the campaign, the snails are gone. One reportedly escaped into the Nile Delta. Another fell victim to a curious lizard. The last, Horus, was possibly crushed under a cavalry boot. No funerals this time. Just a heavy silence. Napoleon doesn't mention them again. But on the voyage home, as his ship cuts across the Mediterranean, he sits alone on deck one night, staring at the sea. An officer approaches, asking about their next move. Napoleon replies, "First, we wait. Like the snail. Then we strike." The officer writes that line down in his log, assuming it's some new tactic. It isn't. It's just Napoleon, thinking about the slowest part of himself, the soft thing inside the hard armor, and how even in a world built on speed and noise, there's power in the patient spiral. You're walking the halls of Malmaison now, Napoleon's countryside retreat just outside Paris. It smells like polished wood, ink, roses, and a faint whiff of something slightly earthy. Not quite unpleasant. Almost garden-like. Josephine is here, tending to her collection of rare plants and slightly judgmental parrots. But tonight, you're following a quieter trail, one that leads behind the orangery, past a trimmed hedge, and into what looks like a tiny, private greenhouse. Inside? A snail garden. Not a metaphor. A literal, purpose-built patch of moss, stones, and humidity-controlled glass. Yes. Napoleon built a terrarium. This was during the consulate years, before he crowned himself emperor. He had power, yes, but was still trying to look modest, well, as modest as a man can while shaping Europe in his own image. In public, military parades, reforms, treaties. In private, a microclimate for gastropods. The structure isn't grand. About the size of a writing desk, tucked beside a trellis of creeping ivy. Some say it was Josephine's idea. Others insist it was a personal request written in Napoleon's own hand, likely somewhere between a banking reform and a military recruitment order. A note survives, scrawled on the back of a state budget draft, "Ensure moss is fresh." The shell is a fortress. The creature, patience incarnate. No signature needed. Visitors to Malmaison didn't usually see the garden. It wasn't shown on tours or referenced in guest guides. But a few servants knew. A few guards knew. And one gardener, an old Corsican named Bartolomeo, kept a daily chart of humidity levels for the general's little friends. You imagine Napoleon, fresh from meetings with ministers, slipping away for 5 minutes of calm. Just him, a footstool, and 6 silent snails named after ancient philosophers. Seneca was his favorite, according to legend. Very thoughtful eyes, he reportedly said. He wasn't trying to be funny. Historians still argue whether this greenhouse was real or apocryphal. Some call it Napoleonic myth-making, others point to the estate's detailed gardening records, which include a line item for small stone enclosure, glass-lidded, to be kept damp. Suspiciously specific. And there's this, a letter from Josephine to a friend, dated spring 1803. He has taken to visiting the snails again. Says they remind him of battles. I cannot follow the logic, but he looks calmer afterward. Calmer. That's the key. Because in these years, Napoleon is becoming something else entirely. The private man is shrinking. The public icon is swelling. Statues are going up. Songs are being written. The myth is overtaking the man. But the snail garden remains. He doesn't speak of it often. It's not for the newspapers. It's a sanctuary. A place where he isn't the consul, or the general, or the man the British papers mock as the Corsican ogre. He's just Napoleon. A boy with muddy boots and a quiet fascination. One aide recalled watching him sit beside the terrarium during a thunderstorm. Not writing. Not planning. Just watching. The aide approached, paused, and was about to speak when Napoleon raised a hand. "Listen," he said. "Even they hear the storm. But they don't flee. They carry on." The aide backed away. There's a strange peace in this memory, a kind of soft rebellion. Because everyone around him wants speed, progress, expansion, faster roads, faster ships, faster wars. But Napoleon still carves out time for slowness. He's famous now, feared, admired. But he still writes metaphors about spirals in his notes. Still refers to hesitation as a coiled moment. Still says things like we must advance at the pace of thought, not thunder. You remember how, as a child, he watched snails on Corsican stones. How he lifted them out of puddles. Now, years later, he watches them again, not for novelty, but for something steady. Some scholars suggest this was about control. That in a world spinning faster and faster, the snail represented a rhythm he could master. Others say it was nostalgia, a way to hold on to a purer version of himself. But a few whisper that it was faith. Faith in progress that doesn't shout. In movement that doesn't leave destruction. In the kind of power that creeps, quietly, and outlasts the noise. He never spoke of them in speeches. Never put them in emblems. But he kept them close, in shadows. When plans went awry, when treaties frayed, when the crown weighed heavy, he returned to the greenhouse. Not to solve anything. Just to watch. At a long, candlelit table now, surrounded by murmuring courtiers, clinking cutlery, and the faint scent of roasted pheasant. Welcome to the Tuileries Palace, Paris, circa 1805. Napoleon is emperor now, robes, medals, portraits with laurel crowns. It's all very official, very gold, very loud. The Republic is long gone. France kneels beneath the crown that Napoleon placed, quite literally, upon his own head. But tonight's dinner has taken a strange turn. A footman emerges from the kitchen, bearing a silver platter of something sizzling, aromatic, and suspiciously shell-shaped. Escargot à la bourguignonne. Snails soaked in garlic butter and herbs, their spiral shells gleaming like tiny helmets. The room quiets slightly. Everyone knows the general's reputation. Not his military one, his mollusk one. You glance down the table. Napoleon sets his fork down. Tilts his head. Examines the platter. Someone tries to break the tension with a chuckle. From your native land, sire. Napoleon's eyes narrow, not in anger, but in something stranger, melancholy? Irony? You're not sure. Then, in the silence, he says, they are soldiers. And you roast them. The laughter dies. One or two guests shift in their chairs. Josephine gives a practiced smile and gestures for the wine to keep flowing. The footman retreats. And for the next several minutes, nobody mentions snails. But the event doesn't end there. Later that night, when the guests are gone and the candles are half melted, Napoleon returns to the tray, now sitting cold and half empty. He doesn't eat one. Instead, according to his valet, he selects 3 intact shells, wraps them carefully in a napkin, and places them in a lacquered box. No explanation. just quiet. It's not the first time he's done something like this. Over the years, members of his household record several odd behaviors involving shelled creatures, declining to walk a garden path until a snail had cleared it. Scribbling tactical notes on scraps of paper with tiny snail shell drawings in the corners. Keeping a folded linen pouch of empty shells of sentimental value in his desk drawer. Historians still argue whether these were quirks, coping mechanisms, or secret symbols. Was Napoleon building a private mythology around snails? Or was he simply holding on to the only part of his life not claimed by empire? A court painter once remarked, half in jest, that the emperor's favorite paintings were those with background foliage, because he liked to imagine snails hidden there. You almost laugh, but then you remember, this is the man who once built an entire greenhouse for them. And now, at the height of power, with kings bowing and maps redrawn, he still sees the shell. There's a deeper irony at play here. Napoleon, one of the fastest-moving conquerors in history, seems obsessed with the slowest creature imaginable. But maybe that's the point. Speed brought him victory. But slowness brought him clarity. One of his aides, Duroc, once wrote in a private memo. He sometimes compares the state to a shell, rigid on the outside, but vulnerable within. He says it should move slowly, lest it crack. Another metaphor. Another echo of the spiral. And then there's the infamous snail funeral. Yes, we're here now. It's 1807. The emperor is inspecting military schools, handing out medals, posing for stiff oil portraits. During a garden reception at St. Cloud, a young boy, son of a nobleman, gleefully stomps a snail underfoot. Crunch! Napoleon hears the noise. Turns. Everyone freezes. The boy grins. Until Napoleon frowns. What was the purpose, he asks. No answer. He kneels, yes, kneels, beside the crushed shell. Examines it. Says nothing. Then stands and declares, all creatures deserve dignity in their ending. He orders a small patch of soil turned. A stone placed. Not a monument. Just respect. From that day, according to legend, the staff avoided stepping on anything that resembled a snail. Better safe than scolded. Was it theatrical? Maybe. But people remember it. Because no matter how strange, it made the emperor seem oddly human. You wonder if that was the point. A quiet protest against the dehumanizing machinery of power. Or just a man clinging to childhood in a world too big for softness. The years roll forward. The palace grows colder. The wars get bloodier. And yet, the snail references persist. In a private dispatch to a marshal, Napoleon writes, "Move not like thunder, but like the shell present before it is heard." His metaphors get stranger, softer, a little wistful. And you can't help but feel that buried beneath the triumph and tragedy, the exile and glory, is a boy who once crouched in a Corsican garden, whispering to a creature no one else noticed. You're standing in a marble hall, and everything smells faintly of beeswax, brass polish, and anticipation. It's 1808, and Napoleon is in full emperor mode. Capes, scepters, and enough medals to make a suit of armor jingle when he turns. You're used to seeing him this way now, tall, only metaphorically, poised, commanding. But today, behind the scenes, there's a different debate unfurling in the quiet corners of court. It's about branding. Yes, even emperors need logos. You see, Napoleon isn't content with mere power, he wants legacy. Symbols. Iconography that says, this man built an empire out of dust and rage. And for that, he turns not to dragons or lions or thunderbolts. No, he chooses bees. Yep. Bees. Specifically, golden bees. Tiny, ancient emblems of industriousness and order, once sewn into the robes of the Merovingian kings of France. Napoleon adopts them like old family jewels. You'll see them everywhere on robes, thrones, carpets, and ink seals. They buzz nobly across the imperial aesthetic. But here's where things get slippery. Because according to one draft report, never officially published, there was a moment, just a moment, when another creature was floated as an alternative symbol. The snail. No, seriously. An early version of the imperial court's insignia brainstorm includes a handwritten note, possibly from a junior designer, possibly from Napoleon himself, with a curious query: what of the snail? Ancient, enduring, armored in its solitude. Historians still argue whether this was a real suggestion or just an idle poetic musing. Either way, it didn't make the final cut. The bees won. But it raises the question, why even consider the snail? You follow this strange thread through court gossip, aide memos, and the writings of Napoleon's private secretary, Bourrienne. In one passage, Bourrienne recalls the emperor ruminating during a long carriage ride. He watched the rain drip down the window, then muttered, "Bees are fast, but fragile." The snail, he survives the flood. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Bees die when they sting. Snails endure by never rushing, by wearing their home on their backs and waiting out the storm. Napoleon might have loved bees for their organization, but he respected snails for their philosophy. You can almost hear him pacing a polished floor, dictating reforms between pauses to consider, spirals. Make the tax code circular, let it coil inward like a shell. Restructure the court so it moves without haste, like the mollusk. Victory, my dear Marshal, is best achieved when the enemy thinks you're slow. Even in the imperial court, whispers about his peculiar fondness for shelled creatures persist. Ministers chuckle, artists speculate. A satirical British pamphlet once depicts Napoleon as a snail with a crown, labeled, his slowness, the emperor of all things spiral. He probably didn't find that one funny. But the imagery sticks. One court jeweler commissioned to design a new ceremonial brooch. Incorporated a tiny snail shell motif behind a golden bee. It was subtle, delicate. Napoleon noticed it immediately. "I see you understand contradiction," he said. The jeweler bowed and never asked what that meant. You find him one evening in his study, rifling through letters. Maps lie open, treaties half folded. A dispatch from Spain is waiting, and a draft of the new civil code has been inked. But he's not reading them. He's staring at a sheet of sketches. Military emblems, symbols of rank. One features a snail inside a laurel wreath. He smiles. Just for a second. And then the door opens. An aide announces a delegation from the Polish nobility has arrived, and the moment vanishes. He stands, gathers his cloak, and becomes the emperor again. But the drawing? He tucks it into his breast pocket. You wonder, was it a joke to himself? A reminder? Or just a comfort? That even while ruling continents, he could still imagine himself beside a stone wall, watching something slow, deliberate, unbothered by crowns. Later, he gives a speech to his generals. It's full of thunder, promises, and patriotic fury. But in the middle of it, he says something odd. We must move as one, sometimes with the sting of the bee, and other times with the calm resolve of the shell. No one blinks. No one asks. They've learned. There are many Napoleons. The strategist, the statesman, the lover, the tyrant. But this one, this strange philosopher of the spiral, slips between the cracks. He doesn't make the statues. But he makes the man. And somewhere, in the dusty folds of forgotten state documents, you find one more line scrawled sideways in the margin of a foreign policy draft: symbols matter. But only the shell survives the crush. You're in the library now, high ceilings and higher stakes, as the empire begins to groan under its own weight. It's 1810, and Napoleon is still atop the world, at least in name. The wars are piling up, alliances are fraying, and his marriage to Josephine has ended like a favorite book with the last page torn out. But tonight, the topic isn't war, or love, or logistics. It's snails. Yes. Again. Because at this strange, pivotal moment when the French Empire stretches from Spain to the Russian border, and Napoleon has just married the young Marie-Louise of Austria, there's a new kind of debate simmering in intellectual circles. A scholarly one. Among the historians and biographers, the philosophers and Parisian gardeners, an odd question emerges: what's with the snails? Seriously. Why does the Emperor of France have such an attachment? Some call it symbolism. Others call it eccentricity. But a few take it seriously, especially the ones close to the earth. Gardeners. An article appears in a small but respected naturalist journal, authored anonymously, titled "Observations on the Emperor's Affection for the Gastropod." It lays out, quite calmly, the idea that Napoleon's interest in snails reflects his deepest tactical philosophies: resilience, terrain control, the advantage of slow maneuvering, and the psychological impact of the unexpected. It's a strange little piece, written with quiet reverence. The final line? Historians still argue whether the shell is a metaphor. The gardener knows it is not. You'd laugh, except this is France, and even the gardeners are philosophers. Meanwhile, inside Napoleon's own house, the whispers continue. His new wife, Marie-Louise, writes home to her aunt in Vienna, "He is gentle with me, and strangely gentle with the smallest creatures. Yesterday I saw him pause mid-walk to kneel and move a snail from the path. He said, 'One should not crush what is only slow.'" It's a line that stays with you. His court begins to notice more references. His speeches now favor spiraling metaphors. He describes political entanglements as slow shells curling inward. He praises patience like it's a weapon. Even his handwriting begins to curl more than it used to. He tells one ambassador, "We must coil like a shell before we strike." The ambassador has no idea what that means. But he nods. And in the background, historians and writers start taking sides. Some mock him, of course. The British press has a field day. One cartoon shows Napoleon leading a battalion of giant snails into battle, shouting "L'escargot," while Wellington yawns. But others defend him. A popular French philosopher pens a scathing rebuttal. What is mockery to a man who outlives his enemies by enduring, not exploding? It becomes a brief, if bizarre, intellectual fashion to use snails as metaphors for political power. Salon debates heat up. Is the shell protection or limitation? Is slowness wisdom or weakness? And while all this swirls, Napoleon himself stays quiet. Except for one curious day. He summons a historian, his official court chronicler, and dictates a section of memoir-like reflection. Most of it is standard imperial stuff, reforms, victories, numbers. But then he pauses, and says, "I've always admired the snail. It survives by simplicity. It does not chase. It endures. It does not boast. It returns to itself." The historian writes it down. No one uses it. It's deemed unfit for public image. Still, the quote survives, buried in private notes, scribbled in shorthand between sentences about cavalry logistics. You find it one evening in an archive, and it feels like reading a secret. And then there's the duel. Not a real one, though with Napoleon, you'd believe it, but an argument between two of his advisors. One claims the snail stuff is nonsense, a relic of Corsican superstition. The other says it's the key to understanding the man himself. They nearly come to blows. Napoleon, hearing of the quarrel, sends each man a letter. Identical. It reads, "The snail is not a puzzle. It is a mirror." Cryptic? Of course. But so very Napoleon. You begin to see the layers. The snail is not just a friend, a metaphor, a private joke. It's a structure, a philosophy, a worldview. He sees the empire not as a pyramid, but as a spiral. Something that must grow from the center outward, never rushing too fast, lest it crack its own shell. And maybe that's the warning. Because even now, the empire is starting to wobble. The wars are bleeding resources. The people are growing weary. His allies are less allied. But he still walks in the garden some mornings, behind the palace, stooping to inspect the stones. Sometimes he finds one of his shelled companions. He doesn't name them anymore. He just watches. Then straightens his uniform, and returns to ruling a world that never learned to slow down. You're on a wind-blown island now, the surf gnawing at the cliffs, the sky a constant shade of sullen gray. This is St. Helena, Napoleon's final stage, his forced encore. The empire is gone. The crown? Vanished. The titles, the parades, the thrones, stripped. What's left is a man, his memories, and a lot of damp wool. It's 1816. The British have parked him on this volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. No escape, no audience, no chance of redemption. He lives in a drafty house called Longwood, surrounded by guards, rain, and more arguments than he has energy for. And yet, there's one quiet companion that seems to follow him, even here. A snail. Or perhaps, the snail. See, not long after arriving, Napoleon began walking the grounds of Longwood alone. Not pacing, he wasn't one to wear grooves in the ground like some caged noble. He wandered. Slowly. Observantly. Watching the sea, the moss, the low, crumbling stone walls. And one day, while bending to examine a sprig of clover, he found it. A small, brown, spiral-shelled snail inching along a lichen-covered stone. Augustus, he said. His valet Bertrand, who'd seen a few too many odd moments by now, didn't ask. That snail became a fixture. Whether it was the same one each time? No one knows. St. Helena had plenty of mollusks, after all. But for Napoleon, it didn't matter. The idea of Augustus. The faithful, armored traveler, the last emperor of a small green patch, was enough. He'd visit the same spot daily. Sit on a flat stone. Let the wind play with the cuffs of his coat. And wait until the little creature emerged from its shell, tentatively prodding the world with delicate antennae. He never touched it. Just watched. "It is better company than most kings," he once muttered. Historians still argue whether these moments were exaggerated in later memoirs. But the references are there. In the letters. In the offhand remarks. In the size between dictating chapters of his autobiography. "I conquered Europe faster than a snail could cross a leaf," he says in one passage, "and yet I think the snail is wiser." Imagine that. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who rewrote the map, now envying something that leaves a slimy trail and naps during drizzle. But then again, St. Helena has a way of changing perspectives. He grows softer. Not weaker. Just less armored. Less focused on conquest, more on meaning. He reads old books, strokes the spine of Plutarch's Lives, and doodles spirals in the margins. One day, a British officer catches him sketching what looks suspiciously like a battle plan. But when the paper is turned, it reveals nothing but a spiral shell, drawn with almost mathematical precision. "You miss war?" the officer asks. Napoleon looks up. "I miss silence," he replies. He writes long, rambling letters to no one in particular. Some addressed to dead friends. Some to the future. One begins with, "In the end, I understand only two things, the folly of ambition and the dignity of the snail." That letter was never sent. Found folded into the pages of a gardening manual after his death. And then there's the rumor unconfirmed, but too poetic to ignore. A month before he dies, he asks his servant to gather snail shells from the garden. "The nice ones," he says. "The ones shaped like patience." They're collected, washed, and placed in a small wooden box, alongside a few clippings from the island's wild mint. It's said that box was on the table beside him when he died. More dramatic stories claim one snail actually crossed his hand as he lay in his final hours, curling slightly against his knuckles. likely false. But a British officer, Captain Henry, did report seeing a small shell tucked under Napoleon's pillow after the body was prepared. No one claimed it. You might ask, was all this symbolism? Sentiment? Senility? Or was it something deeper, a final act of devotion to the one thing that never betrayed him? The only creature that didn't want a throne or a war or a treaty. Just moisture, shade, and the right to go slowly. The snail, perhaps, was always the truest metaphor. Napoleon was never trying to outrun history. He was trying to make peace with the part of him that never needed to run at all. And maybe that's why, in his last days, he didn't ask for banners or anthems or proclamations. He just asked for quiet. For green moss. For a shell. And for Augustus. You're walking through a dusty Paris museum now, the echo of your footsteps mixing with the hum of climate control and the soft click of polished shoes on marble. The year is modern, but the shadows are full of ghosts. Napoleon's portraits line the walls, all stoic stares and eagle crests, swords glinting in hand-in-waistcoat poses. But over in a quiet corner, there's something smaller. Stranger. A snail shell. It sits in a sealed glass case, resting atop a square of velvet. The plaque reads simply, "Unverified object believed to be from Napoleon's effects, found at Longwood House, St. Helena. Donor anonymous. No confirmation. No provenance. Just a whisper, held in glass." You pause. It's tiny. Barely bigger than a coin. Pale brown, with that familiar spiral curling inward like a secret. And whether or not it ever touched Napoleon's hand, it feels like it could have. That's the thing about history. It's not the cannon blasts and treaties that stick, it's the soft, peculiar details. The ones that don't make headlines. Like a general's fondness for a garden mollusk. A man who could command empires, but knelt for a snail. And the fascination doesn't end there. Across France, in the quirkiest corners of Napoleonic lore, a quiet cult of the snails still persists. At a small estate near Ajaccio, Corsica, Napoleon's birthplace, locals tell stories of the boy who used to sit in the garden for hours, whispering to tiny travelers on leaves. One tour guide swears a descendant of the Bonapartes once found a child's drawing of a snail wearing a crown, folded into the pages of a weathered copy of the Gallic Wars. In Paris, an eccentric collector named Gérard Dubois has what he claims is Napoleon's snail box, a wooden container lined with old velvet and, yes, several fragile shells. Are they real? No one knows. He refuses to have them carbon dated. It would ruin the poetry, he says, sipping espresso beneath a mural of the emperor on horseback, except, in this version, the horse is replaced by a gigantic snail. There are others, too. A tiny cafe in Lyon called L'Escargot Imperial serves no escargot at all, only tea, pastries, and books about Napoleon. The walls are adorned with snail-themed Napoleonic memorabilia, stamps, caricatures, even a replica of the supposed Malmaison terrarium. A plaque behind the register reads, "He moved armies like thunder. But he watched snails like a monk." A bit dramatic, sure. But not wrong. Historians, at least the serious ones, have mixed feelings. Some dismiss the snail connection entirely as myth. There's no real evidence, they huff. It's symbolic at best. But others are intrigued. Not by the snails themselves, necessarily, but by what they reveal about the man. Napoleon the thinker. Napoleon the child. Napoleon the quiet observer, who in between battles, reforms, and exiles, still noticed something as slow and small as a snail inching across a stone. One professor, Dr. Therese Lambert, University of Dijon, has even given lectures titled Slowness and Sovereignty, Gastropod Symbolism and Napoleonic Thought. It began as a joke, but the waiting list for her classes is now 6 months long. She's the one who said, the more you look at his writings, the more you realize Napoleon wasn't trying to dominate time, he was trying to understand it. The snail just happened to be his clock. You walk deeper into the museum, and you start noticing it more. The spiral motif on his personal seal. The shell-like curve in the embroidery of his robes. Even in some paintings, you spot them tiny, almost invisible snails hiding in the corners. In the grass. On a column. Tucked in like little, historical Easter eggs. Was it intentional? Was it a private joke among painters? Or did Napoleon leave more of himself behind than anyone realized? You stand in front of one of the great portraits now, the David painting, full of pomp and symbolism. Napoleon pointing skyward, windswept cloak behind him. But in the lower right corner, near his boot, nestled in the moss, a snail. Small. Overlooked. Silent. Just like always. And suddenly, you feel like you understand something about him that no biography ever quite captured. He didn't just admire snails. He was one. Not in body, of course. But in essence. He moved deliberately. Carried his home, his vision, with him. Adapted. Endured. And when the storm came, he curled inward, not to hide, but to preserve. He outlasted many. Outshone many more. And even in defeat, he left behind a trail. Not of slime, but of something slower, stronger, stranger. A spiral. You're leafing through a stack of yellowed letters now, the ink faded like old memories and the paper soft as moth wings. They aren't love letters. Not military dispatches either. These are fragments. Scraps of Napoleon's inner world, written in the quieter spaces between wars and politics. Many were never meant to be read. But here they are, catalogued, translated, and occasionally smudged by curious historians. And here's the strange thing, snails keep showing up. Not just as metaphors or casual mentions, but as recurring characters. Companions. Anchors. One letter, dated 1804, begins like this: "The world does not slow. So I watch those who do. The snail waits for no one. Yet it is never late." It sounds like a proverb, but it's entirely original. Tucked between notes on military payroll and a fleeting complaint about Josephine's spending. In another, addressed to his brother Lucien, he muses, "You accuse me of rushing. Yet I have not moved faster than the land allows. Do you remember the stone garden in Corsica? The snails were always ahead of us, in their way. Lucian never replied to that line. You begin to feel that the snail, Augustus, Cato, Horace, whoever he may have been, was more than a pet. He was a tether. A symbolic friend. A kind of mirror Napoleon consulted when everything else got too fast, too sharp, too loud. And now, in the post-Empire quiet, others are starting to see it too. You visit a small exhibit in a Napoleonic museum in Rochefort. Among the medals and maps, there's a locked display case with what looks like a personal journal. Inside, on one of the pages, drawn in simple ink, is a single spiraling line with the caption, "My thoughts in movement." It spirals inward, not outward. That inward motion is key. So much of Napoleon's life was defined by expansion. More land, more control, more pages in the history books. But in the end, his true philosophy may have always been about contraction, about distilling complexity into something slow and stable. Like a shell, you find more scattered tributes. In Vienna, a scholar compiles a list of Napoleon's private aphorisms. One reads, "Conquest is not speed. It is refusal to stop." In Warsaw, a poet writes a tribute titled "The Emperor's Shell." It paints Napoleon not as a tyrant, but as a tired child who built empires with one hand and shielded snails with the other. And in modern-day St. Helena, a local tour guide keeps a stone in her pocket, smooth, flat, with a snail carved into it by hand. When asked why, she says, "It's what he watched when no one else was looking." Some might call all this sentimental nonsense. A posthumous effort to soften a hard man. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's a glimpse at the truest part of him, the part that never fired a cannon, never gave a speech, never wore a crown. Just the part that watched, observed, endured. One French historian, in an unusually lyrical essay, puts it this way: if we measured greatness not by noise, but by attention, by presence, then perhaps the snail is not Napoleon's symbol, but his teacher. You let that thought rest. And then, as you drift back through archives and anecdotes, you stumble on one last letter. Undated. Unsigned. Possibly even forged. But the handwriting matches. It reads, "I dreamed last night of green leaves and silence. Of a shell, unbroken. I did not win the world. I only circled it. A spiral. Again. The shape of reflection. Of philosophy. Of strategy. The shape that always returns inward." You imagine him now not the emperor, not the general, but the boy in the garden, watching a snail climb a blade of grass. And maybe, just maybe, that's where he was always headed. You're in an artist's attic now, dust motes drifting through beams of morning light, canvas frames leaning against crooked walls, the faint smell of turpentine and yesterday's toast lingering in the air. A sleepy Paris in the late 1800s. Napoleon has been gone for decades, but here in this cluttered studio, he's never felt more alive. Because this artist unknown, uncelebrated, is painting history's oddest tribute. It's a battlefield scene, yes. Soldiers, flags, smoke, the usual drama. But look closer. Buried in the grass, tucked beneath cannon wheels, curled along the folds of a general's cape, there are snails. Tiny, painted with care. Some barely visible. One perched on the edge of a drum. Another making its slow way across a saber. The piece isn't signed. No title. But in the bottom right corner, written in tiny cursive, are the words, "He always watched them." This isn't a joke or satire. It's reverence. The beginning of a strange and beautiful trend in Napoleonic art. They call them gastropod tributes. Little nods. Easter eggs. Whispers across time. One famous 19th century portrait of Napoleon at Austerlitz was found, under infrared, to have a snail ghosted into the background hills. Not visible to the naked eye, but there, all the same. Intentionally painted, then glazed over. Historians, once again, are divided. Some call it whimsy. Others say it's coded commentary. Artists inserting softness into stories of conquest, like planting moss between the stones of war. You begin to see them everywhere. In battle murals, palace frescoes, even decorative china. In a tapestry made to commemorate the Treaty of Tilsit, a spiral motif repeats in the border, subtle, snail-like, not quite floral. Was it intentional? We may never know. But it adds up. There's a theory, a soft one, not academic, that some artists saw in Napoleon what many biographers missed, the paradox. The contradiction. The man who moved fast, but thought slow. Who conquered cities, then paused to examine the shape of a leaf. Who stood atop empires, but still bent to save a creature with no spine. And so the snails entered the myth. You visit a gallery in Berlin. One exhibit features depictions of famous generals through time, each rendered in traditional heroic poses. Napoleon is shown on horseback, sword raised, cape flaring. But beneath the horse's hoof? A snail. It's tiny. You'd miss it if you weren't looking. But once you do see it, you can't unsee it. And suddenly the whole painting feels different. Less boastful. More human. Then you travel to a little-known collection in Geneva. There's a sketchbook on display, faint pencil lines, early studies for a monument that was never built. Most of it is standard stuff, columns, laurels, heroic poses. But one page is curious. A pedestal, spiral like a snail shell, rising from the earth in smooth, deliberate curves. At the top, Napoleon not with a sword, but with a snail in his palm. The idea was scrapped. Too strange. Too soft. But it was dreamed. That much is clear. Modern artists have picked up the thread. A Japanese illustrator recently published a graphic novel titled Napoleon's Snail. It's surreal, dreamlike, entirely silent. No dialogue. Just page after page of the emperor walking through various landscapes, forests, battlefields, gardens, following a single snail. In the final panel, the snail stops. Napoleon sits beside it. And nothing happens. The book ends. Critics called it a masterpiece of stillness. Sales were surprisingly strong. You see, people are starting to understand that beneath the granite busts and martial epics, there was a man who thought in spirals, who respected the unhurried. who never forgot the boyhood hours spent with soft creatures on warm stones. A museum in Toulouse once staged an entire exhibit, The Emperor and the Snail. It featured not just art, but audio installations of whispered quotes, the sound of leaves underfoot, and the soft scrape of shell on stone. The final room? A slow-motion video of a snail moving across a bust of Napoleon. It ran on loop. Visitors sat for hours. There's something comforting about it. Not because it rewrites history, but because it rounds it, softens the sharp parts, reminds you that even the great are shaped by small, quiet things. And maybe, in the end, we paint snails into Napoleon's life not because they define him, but because they explain us. Because we need the story where the man with the thunder in his voice also had mud on his knees and a name for every shell he spared. Because somewhere deep down, we all want to believe that greatness doesn't require haste. That endurance counts. That the spiral, not the charge, might be the true path forward. You're sitting in the back of a lecture hall now. The lights are low, the projector is humming, and the room smells faintly of old coffee and academic ambition. A professor in a rumpled blazer clicks to the next slide. On the screen appears a close-up of a snail. Half the students stifle a yawn. The other half lean in. This is a seminar titled Narratives of Power, the Gentle Symbols of Empire. And today's topic? Napoleon Bonaparte's alleged, lifelong affection for snails. Yes. It's gotten that far. What was once an obscure footnote has become, in some circles, a serious field of study. Papers are published. Conferences are held. A debate rages on whether Napoleon's mollusk affinity was poetic metaphor, psychological projection, strategic philosophy, or simply strange. The professor explains how traditional history favors sharp lines, battles, treaties, names, and dates. But in Napoleon's case, the softness that lingers, the imagery of the snail, is proving harder to ignore. She points out the motifs, the spirals in his diagrams, the snail doodles in his margins, the metaphors in his private correspondence. She pauses, then quotes a passage you've heard before: "The snail survives not by speed, but by certainty." And the room is quiet. Because no one here expected to be moved by a man who ruled with an iron will, but walked with a heart shaped by something so slow, so vulnerable, so, let's be honest, slimy. From the lecture, you drift into the broader world where this legacy has left its imprint. A street artist in Marseille recently painted a mural of Napoleon's silhouette filled with spirals, one continuous shell-like curve from boots to bicorn. In the corner, a tiny cartoon snail peeking out, wearing a medal. Tourists snap selfies in front of it. Children in Ayacho dress as Napoleon and Snails for school plays. In these versions, the snail is always the wise advisor, whispering sage advice about slowing down, planning ahead, and never underestimating damp terrain. You'd think this was parody. But it's not. It's affection. A strange, deep-rooted affection for the idea that even greatness once paused for something small. And then there's the pilgrimage. On St. Helena, a trail now winds past Longwood House and curves gently through a patch of land where Napoleon is said to have walked daily. A modest sign reads, "Snails Walk." Tourists are invited to walk slowly. Some bring snail figurines. Others walk barefoot, to better feel the ground as he did. A few even leave offerings, tiny leaves, bits of moss, handwritten notes that say things like, "Thank you for reminding us to slow down." You find yourself deeply affected. Because somewhere, between all the statues and smoke, between the triumph and exile, the love and the loss, is this unshakable truth, that Napoleon, the most decisive, ruthless, fast-rising figure of his time, found meaning in the slowest creature he could watch. He didn't turn it into a coat of arms. He didn't proclaim it from balconies. He just watched. He learned from it. He carried it, not in the pomp of parades, but in the quiet folds of his days. It shaped his metaphors. It soothed his mind. It reminded him that there is power in slowness, dignity in retreat, wisdom in the spiral. The last slide of the lecture flickers into view. It's a simple drawing. A shell. Spiral inward. The professor clears her throat and says, and perhaps, when he died, the man who moved faster than any of us had finally slowed enough to understand what mattered. No one claps. Not because it wasn't good, but because it felt like a whisper. The kind of thought you don't want to break. And so, as you leave the hall, stepping into the soft light of late afternoon, you notice something strange on the stone path. A snail. Small. Determined. Making its way across the walkway. You smile. And wait for it to pass. Word count, 1,285. You're back where it began, Corsica. The sky is warm and pale, the scent of wild thyme drifts in on a soft wind, and the garden where young Napoleon once knelt is still here, more or less. Time has softened the stones. The fig trees have grown thick and gnarled. The earth is cracked with memory. You walk slowly now, not because you're tired, but because it feels right. There's no plaque for the snails. No statue commemorating Augustus, Cato, Lucilla, or any of the others. But you know they were here. Somewhere between the roots and the shade, in the silence that only a child can find interesting. This place is not grand. It's not imperial. And that's the beauty of it. It reminds you that the most powerful forces in a person's life aren't always armies or empires, but the quiet things. The enduring things. The spirals beneath the surface. Napoleon never returned here. Not physically. But in every slow metaphor, every patient strategy, every coiling pause before a strike, Corsica was present. And the snails, like breadcrumbs in a fable, traced the edges of his soul. You think back on all the places you've been with him. Brienne, Paris, Milan, Cairo, Malmaison, St. Helena, and through them all, this little creature followed. Or led. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a fetish. It was a reminder. A shell, not as decoration, but as philosophy. That life isn't always about the swiftest charge or the loudest cry. Sometimes it's about resilience. Carrying your world on your back. Knowing when to wait. When to spiral inward. When to endure. And yes, even the strongest generals need something soft to hold on to. Perhaps that's why, long after the wars ended, the smoke cleared, and the golden bees dulled with age, it was the snail that endured. Quietly. Unsung. But never forgotten. You sit on a low stone wall, your fingers brushing the moss, and you wonder how many empires were built with the wrong symbols. How many leaders forgot to bend down and notice something small? Then you remember the box. The one said to rest on a shelf near Napoleon's desk in St. Helena. Inside, the story goes, were 6 shells. Empty, but whole. He never told anyone what they meant. He didn't need to. They were his legacy too. Not for parades. For reflection. Wind down, 400 words, and now, as the journey draws to a close, you let the noise of empires fade behind you. You feel the hush of soft soil underfoot. The breath of the breeze as it passes over a crumbling garden wall. The slow, unseen dance of something inching forward beneath a leaf. The world does not hurry here. It never needed to. You breathe in deeply. Let your shoulders soften. Let the image of golden palaces and marble tombs melt into something gentler. Picture the shell again, not as armor, but as home. A place to retreat, to gather, to reflect. A place that moves with you, not against you. That holds memory, but asks nothing of grandeur. This is where we leave him, not in glory or in exile, but in stillness. In that quiet middle space between triumph and tragedy, where the earth is warm and the sky is kind. He's not speaking now. He's watching. And maybe that's the most important thing. So many have rushed through history, clamoring for titles, legacies, lines in textbooks. But the ones we remember most vividly? The ones who watched. Who listened. Who carried something fragile through fire and frost, and never let it break. Tonight, as the lights dim around you, imagine yourself not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but beside a small stone in a Corsican garden. The wind is soft. The world is slow. And somewhere, beneath the green, something is still moving. Tiny. Spiral-shaped. Determined. And as you drift into sleep, remember, even the man who tried to shape the world once knelt in silence, to watch a snail.